So yes, I'm Kath Applin, one of the veterinary advisors at Boehringer. This session is all about monitoring calf shed conditions to support calf health. So to talk about that, here I am. I'm really pleased to introduce my colleague Ailsa Milnes, who's also a veterinary advisor at Boehringer. And Ailsa is going to be speaking with someone, maybe slightly surprisingly, who is a specialist poultry vet. So really pleased to have Barry Thorpe talking with Ailsa on this session. So as I said, Barry is a specialist poultry vet. He's been in poultry practice for around 40 years. And now, as well as teaching at Edinburgh University, he is a consultant for Prognostics, a company that produce monitoring systems for agricultural sheds. So Ailsa is going to speak with Barry about calf shed conditions, how we can monitor those, and what we can learn from the poultry industry. So I'll pass over to Ailsa now.
Hello, good morning. Okay, so yeah, my name's Ailsa Milnes. I'm one of the vets, as Kath said, with Boehringer. And although the title of our presentation this morning is Monitoring Calf Sheds to Support Calf Health, a lot of the time we're going to talk about chickens. As we've been doing a little bit of work, we just started doing some work with the firm Prognostics, and their speciality, as Barry will tell us about, is chicken sheds. And I think there's quite a bit that we can learn about from the poultry industry. So next slide. Sorry, can we have the next slide? Well, I'm controlling it. Great. Okay, so what can we learn from chickens?
Good morning, Ailsa. Good morning.
Good morning. Can't see you, Barry. I think you're
good. Thank you. Yes. This is the first sort of second that you actually know I'm actually here, which you'd be pleased, I guess.
I was thinking I might have to do this on my own and use different voices.
Okay. Well, to introduce myself, I put up 3 slides here. Let's start with 3 pictures on this slide. Let's start with the middle one. The middle one is day-old chicks in a hatchery, and they're produced in batches every day. They'll come from the same parent stock farm usually, and so they're all very similar. If the breeders are 40 odd weeks old, then the chicks will weigh around about 42, 43 grams. And they're all at exactly the same state of development. And on the left, we've got a broiler farm. So these day-old chicks have arrived there. At this point, they're probably about 28 days old. And what's interesting about that farm is that the temperature and humidity is very precisely controlled throughout that shed. There's food and water availability throughout the shed. And these birds are going to go for slaughter around about 34, 35 days. And the farmer is expecting them all to weigh round about 2.2 kilos.
Wow.
If they don't all weigh similar weights, then he will not make as much money on the crop or potentially lose money. So what all these little baby chicks have to do is they have to eat and drink the same amount of food and water every day and grow at the same rate. And that requires the conditions throughout the shed to be the same. If some areas are a bit cold or a bit hot, then they'll not grow as fast in those areas. If they're markedly too cold or too hot, then there's the potential that the chicks become immunocompromised. So we're looking for very much a lot of uniformity to produce a quality product and a massive similarity. We're looking at anything between 10 and 40 or 50,000 birds within a shed, all growing at the same rate and all correctly. The picture on the right is an organic broiler farm. These birds are a bit older because organic birds grow up to 83 days of age. You can see the litter material is straw, and you probably can't see it in the picture so well, but there's a lack of uniformity. There's a lot of variation in weight. And that's kind of okay for the organic market, which is a very small market. But what you tend to find is that there is far less investment in these small farms that are converted to organic. There's not that same consistency in temperature, ventilation, even the provision of food and water supplies. And that results in a loss of uniformity. It invariably results in higher mortality and poorer production. So we see quite a difference in different systems. And one I think particularly interesting to discuss, which we're going to do today for you guys in the dairy sector, is how we actually achieve that very effective, very good uniformity and performance, so that by 35 days of age, which is the end of the crop, we produce 95% of the animals meeting our criteria for selling them.
Crikey, so that's fairly tight, isn't it? I mean, you've got 35 days, we've got an awful lot longer than that. But like you say, the variations are important, and if you don't get things spot on, then you end up having health problems. Is that what we can take from that?
Exactly right, yes. The beauty of the sort of 35 days is you've got a very quick feedback loop. So if you're having problems, you can get them fixed for the next lot coming through. Whereas from my understanding from chatting to Ailsa, is that one of the issues with the dairy side is that your feedback loop is a lot longer.
Yeah.
In some ways that says to me, you've got to actually make sure that things are right, because it's going to take you a long time to find out that they're not right. And by that time, you're going to have lost too much money potentially.
Absolutely.
Of health or welfare issues.
Yeah. So if I just give you a little bit of the stats on the dairy industry, on our industry. So we've actually got a lot of mortality in young calves, and this data is now nearly 10 years old, or over 10 years old, but this was quite a revelation, I think, when it came out, that nearly 15% of the live-born heifers fail to reach their first lactation. And speaking to Jessica Brickell, who did this research back in RVC recently, she doesn't think things have changed much. But what was also interesting from talking to her about the research was that information had to be pulled out from the farms themselves, and that might be something we can talk about later in comparison with poultry. In other words, it wasn't that easy at that point for them to get that data, and some of the farms that were involved were actually quite shocked at the figures they had. And is that common now? Well, yeah, as we said, they think that is roughly the same. And here's some sort of later figures, which is done in a bigger data set. And this is from University of Nottingham, when they looked at basically on-farm mortality from the British cattle movement records. And they were showing that of that on-farm mortality, 25% of mortality occurred in that before 3 months of age. And again, overall, nearly 4%. By 3 months, but the dairy industry was higher at 6% versus beef being 2%, because we've got a much more, I guess, intensive situation going on. And we're aiming at the end of it, like you said, you've got 35 days. What have we got? We've got longer than that, but if we're looking at dairy heifers, then we're looking at 2 years as our age of first calving. So there's a long period along that timeline. And in terms of mortality, what is it we're worried about? Well, the diseases, here's some data from APHA. They were really kind and sent me this over actually last week, so it's fairly up-to-date data, as you can imagine. So mortality in young calves is associated, we always kind of say, oh, we're associated with diarrhea. Yep, crypto, there you go, #1 cause, but also lack of transfer of colostrum. So hypogammaglobulinemia is another term for lack of gamma globulins, lack of colostrum. Cholisepticemia, you might recognize some of these terms from poultry as well, you know, your E. coli's, and again, joint ill, those things are all going to be associated with, well, these three are associated with lack of colostrum. A lot of these things will be, but there's your diarrheas, crypto and rotavirus. And in the slightly older group, up to 6 months, it's pneumonia. Pneumonia is the cause. So our main causes of mortality are going to be basically lack of colostrum, scour, and pneumonia. Pneumonia hugely important. And we
also, that actually has a lot of similarities to the poultry meat sector. Our mortality will be mainly associated with cholisepticemia, with enteritis, and with respiratory issues. You talk about lack of colostrum.
Yeah.
With us in the broiler chicken sector, every little baby chick's born with a yolk sac, and that yolk sac's about the size of a marble. That sac is absolutely full of antibodies. So if you like, that's the colostrum.
Yeah.
The chick, to utilize that yolk sac, it has to have access, and it has to drink and eat in that first 24 to 48 hours. If it doesn't absorb the yolk sac, and its susceptibility to infection increases massively. So, okay, you've got colostrum, we've got yolk sacs. You've got to have your conditions right to get that colostrum into your calves in that first few days. We've got to have the conditions right to get that yolk sac absorbed in the first couple of days. If it doesn't happen, we've got a problem. Your mortality figures are, our mortality figures, total mortality end of crop is around about 4%.
Mm-hmm.
Our 7-day mortality, which if you like we would class as our neonatal, is half of that. It's about 2%.
Yeah, so you're doing worse.
Your organic sector, and could I please ask no one to quote me because I'm pulling this figure off the top of my head, but the organic sector, I would guess our mortality is around about 10%.
Crikey, yeah. So way to go.
Okay.
Yeah, we want to talk about return of investment because that's important. So this, just to put it into context, I guess, because you're quite a figures man. So the average cost of rearing a heifer is £1,800. That's a fairly significant investment if you can think about, you know, what our mortality figures are. And what that means is that it's about growth. It's about getting that daily live weight gain so you get them to calve down at the right weight, and it's about 0.8 kilograms a day we're looking at, and anything that knocks them off, so nutrition and disease, and BRD is almost synonymous with growth. You know, if you've got BRD, you're having your checks and your growth rates. That increases, as we say, the age at first calving. What cost wise, I think the average is about £2.87 a day for every increased day that you've got above your target. Overall, milk yields are down, not just in the first and second lactation, but lifetime milk performance is down, because effectively you've got lower life expectation. So not good, you know. The other thing we've got as well, which I guess you'll talk more about in a bit if you can, is antibiotics. You know, the antibiotic use, we're being driven to reduce antibiotics, and that's got to be a good thing to try and reduce the MR. And the dairy sector, like all of our sectors, has done extremely well since these targets have been introduced, and we've got sector specific targets, as we know. This is a figure I got from NML. They were really kind to give me this, which our target, which is, you know, 21 megs PCU for the dairy industry last year, and at that point 2/3 of farms are below that. And talking to vet practices, some vet practices have got an average of 11 megs PCU for some of their herds. So again, we're doing well. But we know that antibiotics are a hotspot, and that's an area that's also been focused on. And the main aims there are to reduce disease, and through that, there's been an increase in, one of the targets is to increase BRD vaccination. You know, if you increase vaccination with the aim of reducing disease, and with that, reducing the use of antibiotics, reducing those losses, and improving your efficiencies. So what about poultry? What's the sort of story with poultry? Because they've kind of, hate to say it, but previously had a bit of a bad reputation, haven't they?
Yes, poultry, it's intensive livestock, as all the listeners know. And the whole poultry industry, poultry meat industry, really got going after the Second World War. And there's no doubt about it, it got going on the back of antibiotics. By using antibiotics, it allowed intensification, it allowed large numbers of animals to be kept in enclosed spaces, and it controlled the background challenges of bacterial infection. And it did that very, very well. And we were all happy about that, but really until about 1990s. And then there started to be concern about antibiotic growth promoters, because chicken food up to then for meat chickens contained antibiotics. And on top of that, there was routine, regular medication of meat chickens with antibiotics. But there was a requirement to remove antibiotic growth promoters, initially by the buyers, the supermarkets, the fast food outlets. They started insisting there was no antibiotics. And then that was followed very closely by legislation. That process has really continued right up until now, and particularly in the last 10 years, there's been a massive reduction in the use of prophylactic antibiotics on poultry farms. Particularly, again, the supermarkets have insisted a variety of antibiotics aren't used, so you're not allowed to use fluoroquinolones, you're not allowed to use colistin if you're selling your chickens into Tesco or McDonald's or whatever. And there's been the cessation of prophylactic use. It was very common, probably more than 90% of day-old chicks got antibiotics through the water for the first 3 to 5 days. That just stopped. There's, as the dairy sector, there is recording and analysis of antibiotic use. There's a requirement to achieve less than 50 mg per kilogram of chicken meat produced. But on top of that, the supermarkets, the fast food guys, they require the data to be sent to them on a regular basis, usually every 3 months. and they speak to the producers of chicken meat, and they require a continuing reduction in usage. So that, and the targets, a bit like the dairy sector, the targets have been consistently exceeded, which has been good, but it's presented enormous challenges. So what was the downside? Well, the downside, the quality of chicks was reduced, and that's actually not the chicks that left the breeder farm, but the quality of the chicks in the first 24 to 48 hours. We got a lot of health issues, a lot of disease issues, because they were experiencing bacterial challenge. And that had to be addressed. There was an increase in 7-day mortality, an increase in what we call biome-related disease, which mainly tended to be enteritis, but a bit of respiratory as well. Reduced weight gain, loss of profitability, and general concern and a degree of panic to some extent.
Yeah. So how, so I presume, from what you've sort of said, and we're facing, it's the same. The producers drive the change, and then people have to, that need to reduce your antibiotics is driven by legislation and producers. And once those mechanisms are in place, then change is the next step, isn't it?
Yes, and the general move, there's a list of things here, but the general move initially was to reduce the disease challenges, so security, to improve the quality of the day-old chicks, particularly as far as resistance to disease is concerned. And that was really done in two ways. One was by actually making sure that the breeders had a really good, effective vaccine program, so the antibodies transferred in the yolk were really good. And then making sure the environment for the young chicks and through growth was correct. One of the things you've got about chickens, meat chickens, is up until 21 days of age, they can't properly modulate their body temperature. So they need to be in an environment that is the correct body temperature for them. And if it's not, if they feel too hot or too cold, they don't eat and drink properly. If they don't eat properly, then you get into a cycle where they're becoming stressed, they become immune compromised, and you get disease, basically. So the big question is, how do you do all of this? And the way it's been done is by enhancing the data gathering as to what's going on as far as the management and environment of the chickens is. Where that environment is not correct, and where you get correlations between poor performance and an incorrect environment or incorrect management practices, you then modify it. And the beauty of the chicken system, the meat chicken system, is you've got this very fast feedback loop, which you guys haven't got, which means, as we said before, from what you've just said, Ailsa, you can make a mess in the first 2 weeks of the calf's life, and yet the impact from that continues for 2 to 3 years, maybe longer.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. I mean, like you say, if they don't get passive transfer, then those animals have got an increased likelihood of dying. End of. Yeah.
So there's quite a bit we've been doing, especially in prognostics, to actually look at data and data management and analysis of environment. But we'll come back to that later on, Ailsa.
Yeah. Okay. So I mean, realistically, what I'm just about to talk about was this multifactorial etiology, which we see an awful lot in cows, but I guess we see it in all systems, and yours would be the same. So this idea that the outcome of disease is an interaction between the pathogen, the system, in other words, what we've just been talking about and what we're going to go on to talk about, and the animal's own immunity. Now, from our point of view, that's vaccines and colostrum. And from your point of view, I guess it's vaccines and yolk sac, to get the animal's own immunity.
Yes, and what you're talking about is very much what I like, which is a holistic approach, which you look at all the factors. And if you go back in time in the chicken industry, you've got all those different factors there. If you throw a good lot of antibiotics on top of that, suddenly they stop mattering.
Yes.
You take antibiotics away, and you're open to problems, and any one of those can trigger things. So you've actually got to tackle them all.
Yeah. So the antibiotics effectively hide a multitude of sins.
Exactly, yes.
And what we're trying to do, we've got this for calves, but I guess kind of similar for chickens too, but you've got a much tighter window, is that we're trying to push the balance in favor of this resilient, well-built calf, which is to do with its own holistic immunity, and countering that are going to be our stress factors or environmental factors, and part of those are going to be about nutrition, buildings, hygiene, and all the other bits of stress. And what we're trying to do is push everything in favour of the calf or the chicken, and not in favour of that ubiquitous bug. And you're
exactly the same story. And one thing which isn't there and a lot of people forget about is when they think about immunity, they think about antibodies to specific disease. Mm-hmm. What people don't think about often is what I call innate immunity.
Yeah.
Our mucous membrane, like the respiratory system or the gut, has just in the mechanisms by which it works it provides a degree of protection against disease. But as soon as an animal is stressed, a little bit dehydrated, a bit too hot, a bit too cold, the efficacy of that innate immunity is diminished, and it opens the window to problems. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think innate immunity is really an interesting point, isn't it? And it's maybe something that you guys are slightly more ahead of or discussing than perhaps we are. But I'm sure with everything to do with immunity after COVID, everybody's going to be much more understanding about immunology and the various bits. But your innate immunity is almost your primitive immunity, isn't it? And that's why at those mucosal surfaces, which are entry points, it's so important. And the two main diseases are at those entry points, either the respiratory tract or intestinal tract in a way.
Exactly, yes, yes.
So if I was to talk about the environmental challenges that we've got for our calf housing, you've got roughly those 5 factors there. Hygiene, ubiquitous hygiene, it's really obviously dreadfully important. And this need for fresh air, and fresh air can be divided in, as we all know now, to 2 things. Almost that need for fresh air, which is to do with your ventilation, getting it in, but not to be compromised by drafts or airspeed, because we've got this chill factor going on in calves as well. And moisture. So moisture, if it's too wet or moist in a building, it's a breeding ground for bacteria and viruses. And temperature, again, too warm can give you the right environment for bacteria, but too cold, which we know for very young animals is hugely detrimental because of their lower critical temperature. But you know, maybe this is just a bit, everybody here probably knows this, but the worry or the concern with ventilation is that the theory is that we rely a lot, or traditionally have relied a lot, on the stack effect or natural ventilation. But that relies on an animal ruminating or driving enough heat so that you effectively have this rising air, hot air coming in, and then this cold air coming in. So a bit like a chimney. But your downside is that tiny baby calf isn't actually a ruminant. It's not producing enough heat to drive that stack effect. And so we've got inadequate ventilation in those areas. And also we're worried about the possibility of drafts with those young calves. Temperature, as we talk about, really important. And as you can see, we've got this idea of lower critical temperature, which I guess you've got too, Barry, and you can tell me about that. But the lower critical temperature of any animal is the temperature it can withstand without diverting any of that energy, which is going in and feed, to keeping warm. And remember, what we're trying to get that energy to do is to grow and also to work its immune system to keep it healthy. So if an animal's in a cold environment, then it's diverting that energy into just keeping itself going by shivering, and it's going to have to expend more of that precious energy as the temperature drops. And there's a relationship between the factors in the house, so that although the lower critical temperature we might say is 10 to 15 for a 3-week-old calf, depending on what other conditions. So if it's in a howling gale, it'll reduce it if it's damp. So you can see there from AHDB that things like wet concrete, they will increase the lower critical temperature that animal can cope with, which is really, really important. And that data has almost been shown, again, recently, data coming out of Nottingham University, which is just what I presented earlier, that there's an association, and this is repeated by other researchers, between environmental temperature. So low environmental temperature, regardless of month, is associated with increased mortality, and that has a potential. And on that data set that they looked at, they were suggesting that if you could replicate the optimum environmental temperatures all year round, you would reduce your mortality quite a lot, quite significantly, potentially to save 37,000 deaths with a huge amount of financial savings, let alone welfare. So in the quest for the perfect calf house, I guess we're looking for some answers from the poultry industry, really. and hopefully the experiences you've got, Barry, from looking at the history with poultry can give us some information about what you've done.
Yeah, well, what we've really been developing in the last 3 to 4 years is a far more robust way of actually getting information about the environment. We've got temperature sensors, humidity, CO2, light, air pressure, but we've gone to a process where, rather than in a shed, a poultry shed is often been 40 or 50 meters long, 20 meters wide. Historically, you would have maybe 2 sensors in there for temperature, which don't actually tell you very much about the temperature in the whole building. They only tell you about the temperature in 2 parts of it. The cost of sensors has come down enormously. So now we use multiple sensors, get a whole pattern of the actual temperature throughout the shed. We tie in that data with performance and health indicators, water consumption, weight, activity, and we're then doing very detailed data analysis. And I think we've got a bit more on the next slide.
Yeah, okay.
So this is a temperature profile.
Okay.
You can just click it so it runs.
Right.
Looking at a poultry shed, it tells us at the top it's crop number 12, it's day 0, so these are day-old chicks. I'm looking for a temperature of just above 30 degrees in there. If it's
Tropical.
blue, it's too cold. If it's dark red, it's too hot. And I'm looking for those conditions throughout the shed because I've got little baby chicks throughout the shed. And so from this heat mapping, I can actually see the cold spots, the hot spots, and make modifications to the inside of the building to actually try and achieve exactly what I'm looking for.
Oops. Sorry, Barry, I think I've gone too far on there. Right, that was the next slide. So this is this is one of your tracings as well, isn't it? My goodness, yes.
Yeah. So this is looking at temperature, and there is a grey band. The age of the chickens is across the bottom from 0 through to 20, 28, 29 days.
Yeah.
The wide grey band is the target. So it's a fairly narrow target. It starts off at between 30 and about 33.5. And we're looking for the temperature to stay inside that band. The actual average temperature in the shed is the white line that goes, the white line right up to 20 days is within the band. It's then drifting slightly above it. Suggests it was probably summer. But the wider orange band shows the variation in the shed. And so I can see immediately in the first 24 hours, I had cold spots and hot spots in that shed. And
so this bit here, yeah, quite a lot of variation here, yeah.
Exactly right. And I know that little chicks that were put in that part of the shed, if they're too cold, then they've been huddling up and not eating and drinking. If they're not eating and drinking, they're not utilizing their yolk sac. If they're not utilizing their yolk sac, then they are compromising themselves. They're becoming dehydrated. That innate resistance to disease is diminished, and they will perform more poorly. The ones that are too hot will be sitting there panting. Again, they'll not be eating and drinking because they feel too hot. And so a proportion of the birds in that shed I know will be slightly compromised.
So you've got this temperature going down day by day. It's therefore quite a sort of intensely managed setup, isn't it, for these houses?
It's very intensely managed, yes. And I guess, I mean, that in those first few days, what are we doing? We're very much replicating what the mother hen would do with its chicks, particularly at night. She'd have them all huddled up underneath her, next to her breast, where that temperature is bang on about 32 degrees. They can then move slightly as they get older, so they can go to a slightly cooler area as they require to. So we're trying to do that. One question I've got is, how closely are you with your young calves replicating the conditions that the dam would look after them in? I like sheep, and certainly when you look at the sheep lambing outside, what they do when the weather's horrible, they're jammed up against a nice heater, which is their mum, keeping warm. They can't do that. If you have to get the lambs in, the mum dies or whatever, they're in a drafty old shed. You have to have heat lamps and everything there, otherwise they're just not going to do.
Yeah. I mean, you've done some stuff, and you'll show us the traces from the calf sheds, but it'll be interesting when we've talked about lower critical temperatures, and we know that environmental temperature is. We're not getting there. So this is one of your other outputs.
Yeah, this is just showing humidity. shows that there's a vast variation in humidity initially for the first 4 days there. The interesting thing about humidity is as you increase the humidity, you make the environment feel warmer. So where there's high humidity, the temperature feels warmer and is warmer effectively for the chicks. Where it's low, it's colder. So you actually have to adjust your temperature targets by humidity. And what I'm looking for is this humidity to narrow down and be a fairly tight band. And that has failed in those first 4 days there in that house.
Yep.
Then running from about day 9 above target. Now that, but he's actually fairly tight, but he is above target. So he can actually afford to reduce his target temperature probably by about 1 degree because of that. And that's getting into the details, so we'll not worry about that too much.
Okay.
But it is important to look at those interactions between humidity. Also, if humidity is too high, you've got damp spots in the ship, and that may be promoting some bacterial problems and stuff like that.
Yeah. And this is combining it, is it?
Yes, this has got quite a lot of data on it here. And I'll start with the little pie chart in the middle. I know it's quite small, but you don't need to see the detail. But that pie chart is what we call rejects data. And when you slaughter the chickens, the slaughterhouse records every bird that fails to pass meat inspection and puts a reason against it. And the reason, the largest group there is the sort of pale green from 6 o'clock to 9 o'clock, and they've got ascites. And ascites is associated with a heart failure problem. It's a metabolic disease. And one of the common causes of it is if the baby chicks are too cold, then they're burning energy to try and stay warm. And in burning energy, they raise their heart rate and they stress their heart. So I know from that slaughterhouse data that I've got ascites and what's causing it. Now, if I look at the graph on the upper right, the orange bands there show the variation in temperature, and up to day 10, 11, 12, I've got part of that shed that's too cold compared to the target. The average temperature in the shed is fine, so I know I've got part of the shed too cold. And then the other two diagrams there are climate maps. The one on the left is the average temperature throughout the crop, so from day 0 up to probably about day 30, and it shows the variation, the average variation from target. And the critical thing is there's on the bottom left of that house, there's 2 areas there in purple, and the purple there shows that it's far too cold, and you can see it's more than 6 degrees below target. So that's a cold spot.
Yeah.
The other diagram of the shed is just a 24-hour climate map. And the reason for having the 24-hour map there is by running it, I can see whether that cold spot is there for only, say, during the night, or is it there for the full 24-hour period. So that gives me enough information to go back to the farmer and say, you're too cold in part of the shed. This is the part of the shed that's too cold. It's causing ascites. You've got increased condemnations. You'll have less uniformity, etc. Because of that, we need to look at what's causing that in the shed. And in that case, it was a leaking inlet vent. Now, one of the reasons for showing this is a broiler farmer will go and walk around his chickens in the shed between 2 and 4 times a day, inspecting them, picking up sick animals, that type of thing. And this was a fairly good farmer. He'd been walking around inside that shed. He had not, on his inspection of the shed, picked up that problem. He was unaware he had a cold spot.
Yeah, so it's the data that shows it because it's objective.
It's the data, yes,
yeah,
exactly.
As opposed
the
to your own
data allows us to do the analysis to find out where the problem is. And this isn't that subtle a problem. It's a fairly obvious one. Once you get more subtle issues, then it's even more difficult for whoever's looking after the animals
Absolutely.
to identify it.
It's quite detective work, isn't it? You know, you think about it, you've got effectively there's condemnations with ascites, and you've linked it just back to one little cold spot with something that needs to have a spanner to tweak, or am I simplifying it?
Yeah, and the beauty is that this next crop going through, he's fixed the leaking vent. We can check from the climate maps, etc. That's all okay from the variations in temperature, and then we'll have the follow through. Has that actually improved the ascites or not? And in this case, it did.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
You'd hope. Right. So this is because you've started now putting in some, okay, COVID slowed us down, but the idea was that we were going to put some sensors into some calf houses, weren't we, to sort of see what the difference was there. And these are not obviously purpose-built buildings.
Exactly, yeah. This is some initial data. So in this calf house, we've got about 4 or 5 different sensors. There are different coloured plots on this graph here. The reason we did put more than one sensor in is to actually see how much variation we get throughout the building. We've got dates across the bottom. So this was recording from January the 15th for a week. And we've got the temperature on the y-axis from 0 up to 14 degrees. These are quite young calves in here. I can't remember what age they are, but the conditions in the building would have been the same whether there were day-old calves put in or whatever. And so we've got a diurnal variation, dropping down to 2 degrees at night on one night and hitting a maximum of 12 degrees. Ailsa, what temperature did you say was target temperature for young calves?
10 to 15 degrees. Yeah.
So however you argue it, these calves are, in my book, are colder than you would like at night, and very minimum they're going to need sufficient food to actually produce the energy. But if you're increasing their metabolic rate to do that, you are stressing them, I would have thought.
Yes, yeah. And equally, what about did you look at environmental temperatures outside? Because I'm presuming that this is matching your environmental temperature, is it?
Yes, it did. So basically the building had very little effect on altering the temperature. The temperatures outside are very similar. And in fact, outside during the day, it would get warmer than it was actually in the building, because inside you're in the shade, outside you could have the sun. So what was the building doing? It was affecting air movement, wind. Was it modifying the temperature the animals were seeing? Very little.
Yeah, so acting as a nice big fridge to keep your calves in the winter.
Possibly, yes.
Yeah. It's when you see it like that, you think, oh my goodness, yeah. Okay, so what we've basically said, I'll just skip through these two, they're not really relevant, but I guess this is something we'd put together as part of our sort of Calf Matters initiative, and looking actually, maybe I should mention this idea of Kaizen, so continuous improvement, and almost what you're talking about, this idea of total quality management, of understanding your system and making those changes. But we looked at all the details and tried to put it into sort of 4 main areas. And we were looking at management. In other words, what are your, for want of a better word, your standard operating procedures? What are you aiming to do? Obviously, prevention with the need for prevention. And we're kind of all aware of that, colostrum, this, that, and the other. But the other 2 areas which we felt were really important was teamwork, so that everybody on the farm knows what's happening. And an example that would be one of our, some really good calf rearers would say that they don't want the calves to know who's going in there. If they can't make it that day, whichever one of the team goes in to look after the calves shouldn't notice a difference. Everything should be done to a system, so that there's no discrepancies on day-to-day running. And equally, again, from what you've said as well, we've been talking about this too, looking at what data is effective for you and monitoring that data so that you've got objectivity as opposed to just perception, and therefore making the changes, monitoring again and seeing if you're getting those improvements. And that sounds like it's quite similar to some of the things that you've been talking about from a total quality management point of view with poultry.
Yeah, no, I think you're exactly right. If I go on to a well-run farm that's got a good team working there, and the birds are maybe 14 days of age, and they've asked me to go there because they've got a problem, I can go on that farm. I initially don't need to talk to anyone or see anyone, because the systems they've got and operate to should tell me exactly what has happened to those chickens up to 14 days. That has failed to happen for any reason. There should be enough data there within the system, within notes, etc., for me to actually interrogate what's going on without actually having to be told what the problem is. I know exactly what temperatures they should be brooded at. I know how much water they should have drunk a day, how much food they should have had a day. I know when they should have been vaccinated, and there should be sufficient recording of those processes for me to see that. if I'm not finding that when I go onto a farm, then I immediately start to become suspicious that there's actually going to be problems.
Cool. Yeah. Yeah. So having that data there is highly important. We've got some resources, as I say, on our sites. So I suppose what we're doing, this is the early stage with our interaction with prognostics, but there does seem to be definite lessons we can learn from the poultry industry, and we're going to carry on with this initiative. But our take-home messages from a calf point of view is that respiratory disease, we keep saying, it's got a huge impact on calf health and growth rates and farm productivity and sustainability. And therefore, a bit like we've been talking through with poultry and with calves, understanding your own system so that you can identify your own pinch points is really important. And there are lessons in all that from the pig and poultry industry that we can use in the cattle industry too. And that what we're trying to do is almost aiming for continuous improvement through that term total quality management. So if you've got disease issues, you're not going to really get those right until you have everything else, until all your ducks are in a row. And to do that, you need to basically understand your system, use the data that's appropriate to you and record that data, benchmark against yourself and make the changes that you need to do, and then repeat on a continuous improvement basis. And that communication is extremely important, whether that's just between people on the farm and also with your vet, so that they know what the situation is, so that you can use your vet for prevention rather than as a reactive approach. And keep monitoring so that you can show the benefits of those improvements. And from that point of view, by being able to show the benefits, you can support the changes that you've made and keep everybody else focused on producing the best system that you can. Do you have anything else to add, Barry, before we take questions?
I guess the only thing I would add there is the emphasis on sort of critical time points. And for me, with chickens, that critical time point is the first 24, 48 hours. And extending up to 7 days. And if you don't do that first 24, 48 hours correctly, then after that, you're almost wasting your time. And you can actually look at 7 days and look at 7-day weights and uniformity. And your final slaughter weights, your final uniformity is invariably very closely associated with how well you've done that first 7 days. If you don't get the first 7 days, in particular the first 48 hours right, you'll not, as a chicken farmer, you'll not stay in business very long. And I will often, with problems, be actually going back and looking at that early period and what are they doing there then. Get that right, and then do the follow through.
Yeah.
I don't know, I would guess with your calves, maybe your time frame stretches out a bit to the first 3 weeks, but would that be your most critical time?
Well, that's where we're seeing the mortalities, like you've said. Yeah. So early, it's difficult to catch up. As you say, it's very difficult. The food conversion efficiency is earliest pre-weaning, is greatest pre-weaning. So, you know, from that point of view, yep, you want to make use of your resources. And going back a step again, right back to that first sort of 24, 48 hours, it's that the best thing you can do is get the colostrum into them, adequate colostrum. And we still know that although we talk about these things, I think a lot of the studies and the research shows that even that can be difficult on all systems for all calves, and that you're going to always be, if you're playing catch up, then it's going to be extremely difficult to get to those targets.
I mean, it's very easy to use mortality as an index for problems.
But it's morbidity as well, isn't it?
Yes, and I mean, we look at 7-day weights. We also look at crop fill. Crop fill is where you're going to pick up a sample of chickens at 12 and 24 hours after placing them, and you just check that they've got a decent amount of food in their crop, which is very quick and easy to do. And we're looking for better than 95%. Otherwise, we know there's going to be a problem. I guess with calves, you've got recording of the amount of colostrum they're given. Do you look at sort of like 7-day weights or something like that as to initial weight gain?
People are starting to use sort of weight tapes more often, but I don't know if that would be routine. It'd be an interesting thing that we could be asking. But yes, the use of weighing is becoming more, is being used more often as a standard way of gauging like you said, we've got that 24 months if you're talking about heifer rearing, and so therefore you've almost got to gauge yourself all along the way. There's definite targets, and those can be found on AHDB, but it's related so that you've got a target weight for weaning, so doubling in by your birth weight by weaning, and various other bits like that. But it's actually going ahead and measuring those and making sure that you know what's right for your farm. Yeah.
Good.
Hi, Kath.
Thanks, both. Hi, hello. That was fantastic. I certainly learned a lot, and I think it really just shows what we can learn from each other by working across different sectors. And I think it looks like the rest of the audience found it very interesting as well, because we had lots of questions coming through. I might start with a question from Julia. So obviously it would be great if we had all temperature controlled buildings to keep our calves in, but in reality we don't. So I guess we have to manage with what we've got. So Julia says that her calf house in temperatures get sub-zero at times because it's open fronted, which wouldn't be unusual. But with a good straw bed and no drafts and ad-lib milk powder and calf coats, should they be worried? I don't know, both of you, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, my first comment would be the shed. If she's creating a calf nest in there, it'd be interesting to know what temperature the calf's actually seeing as opposed to the actual general temperature in the shed. My gut feel, more a general response would be, from what I've been learning from Ailsa and other people, is that first few days that are critical. My temptation would be to look at the value of investment in a facility or building that is actually designed for purpose to actually create the right environment for that first 2 to 3 weeks. Obviously, it wouldn't be a concern for calves that are 3 months old, but and the time frame they'd be in there would be relatively short. And the potential for a capital return on that would be far greater. If you're talking about the cost of rearing a calf is £1,800, and the potential losses with lactation losses, etc., then it would be a reasonable job to do a decent analysis as to return on investment.
Yeah, I guess what you could say as well would be to Julia is, if you're measuring your calves, which we've been talking about, are you getting the growth rates that you're expecting, and are you looking at, look at, again, back to your system, look at your temperatures, look at your own data and your own morbidity and your own mortality data to see if there's a problem going on there. And as Barry was saying, often it's almost like with young calves, microclimates, and I mean, and that's the other bit that we're kind of getting good at, aren't we? So the aim, like we know, the open fronted gives you that good flow of ventilation, but you're trying to reduce the drafts, and so therefore almost having sides that are if you've got a draft coming in, that you've got straw bales baled up to try and reduce any drafts, or they can use windbreak material as well when the conditions are needed, can reduce the impact of drafts. And it would be interesting possibly to look at, like Barry has said as well, the environment around those calves. So if you've got temperature settings or sensors that we can use, is that something you were talking about, Barry, that these sensors are coming down in price? Is that something that can, we think, be used? I know we're putting them into some farms, but is it something that farms can be using them, even just minimum temperature?
Yes, I mean, if you're putting coats on the calves, I almost wonder if we can actually put a temperature monitor on the coat.
Yeah, wonder if it would just get their body heat. That's the thing. And the other bit as well is people have been using more of actual heat lamps themselves in farm buildings too, and showing that the calves can move towards those as well. So if they are cold, then they can huddle in warmer areas as well. So there's things that we can do to try and it sounds like you're doing them, to try and make sure that those microclimates in those buildings are much better for the environment for the calf.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, and just talking about the microclimate thing, we've had a question also about if you're going to use sensors in a calf shed, any guidance on where you might put them? So
I'll have to ask Barry that one, since he's
well, currently the sheds we've been looking at, they're usually divided into pens using metal gates, and what we've done is we put the sensors attached in a box to the gate at calf height. So we're actually recording temperature and humidity at calf height. So that's the way we're doing it currently.
Any problems with them being sucked off or anything, or do you have to put them into anything protection?
We use good quality, I was going to say Tupperware. I'm not sure if Tupperware is a brand or not, but good quality, thick Tupperware type boxes,
Right.
and cable ties, but sort of industrial cable ties, and that seems to work fairly well.
Okay, yeah. There's a question from Mark here. Would you agree that studying animal behaviour is also important as well? So you talked about the sort of clustering and positioning of animals.
Yes, I mean, animal behaviour is the historically the traditional way of actually assessing whether baby chicks are too hot or too cold, whether they're grouping up together to try and keep each other warm, or whether they're spreading out because they actually their siblings are a source of too much heat. So yeah, behavior definitely is useful, but it's kind of, I guess what you're saying is behavior is slightly after the event, because the behavior is a reaction to it being too hot or too cold, and what you're trying to do is actually keep them at the right temperature.
But isn't that partly the
Also
thing?
How do you do it 24/7?
Yeah, but isn't that the same thing as like cow signals and calf signals, isn't it? You're okay, like you say, it's after the event, but it can tell you something, can't you? By watching what they're doing, you'll work out,
Yes.
what the problems can be.
Yeah. No, I mean, observation of livestock is, you always learn something. There's absolutely no doubt about it at all. And what's the difference between a good stockman and a bad stockman? One of the big differences is ability to observe the animals and what they're doing.
Yeah, and I guess what you're saying is that technology now can just add to that and increase the kind of sensitivity of it. You were talking about the good poultry farmer that you had that still wasn't able to spot that cold spot that was picked up by technology. So I suppose that technology is just one extra tool in the box to complement good husbandry, isn't it?
It all works together, and it's that 24/7. I mean, that graph that I showed of those temperatures, the temperatures were down at 2 degrees at what, 2 o'clock in the morning. Now the best stockman's probably not going to make a regular visit to the calf house at 2 o'clock in the morning, especially if he's getting up at 6 to help with milking.
No.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So I think what we're also saying as well, isn't it, is that that good stockmanship is the technology is not a replacement, and that often really good stockmen can make what is a fairly bad situation much better just because of their degree of ability and how good they actually are.
And more than that, because one of the things we do with the data as we get it and it's coming together is then say to the stockman, look, I'm seeing this. Your CO2 levels are too high or whatever, and it's occurring through the night. What do you think is happening? How do we fix it? Or and they are very much an integral part of the process.
Okay, yeah, excellent. So we've just got literally 2 minutes left. Just a final quick question for you, Barry. So knowing what you know now about calf houses and what have you, if you were building a calf house, thinking about cost considerations, what would be your key priorities for a calf house building?
I guess I'd be looking for a decent amount of insulation and controlled ventilation where you're actually controlling the airflow through it, because these calves are not, especially young calves, are not producing enough heat themselves to actually drive ventilation. So you're going to have to actually have an active ventilation system. You're not going to have to move a lot of air because they're not actually expiring a lot of air. And if you're controlling the temperature, so you've got to have a heat input as well, then you're not going to get the problems of condensation and humidity. So, and then I look at the size of the building, and that's the difficulty. If you've got a short season of calving, then you're going to need a big building, and that's going to be expensive. Ideally, if you did your calving over an extended period, like 12 months, then you're only going to need a building that's good enough for a twelfth of the number of calves you produce in a year. So you actually have to look at integrating it into the whole farming operation. A little bit of lateral thinking. If you're building a bigger building, you're going to use it for 3 months. What can you do with it for the other 9 months? I don't know. Turkeys for Christmas, if it's environmental controlled, mushrooms, growing cannabis, obviously. A bit of lateral thinking, and you can maybe also get a farm diversification grant.
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm just thinking off the top of my head.
Okay.
Well, actually, just going back to that research I was looking at the beginning. So they did the 11 commercial farms. So the all year round farms, they had no more than 8 calves born in the same week. And if the cat, and being, you would know your own pattern, I guess, you know what your expectations would be and what you'd need the size of building. It's much more difficult, isn't it, for block calving, but for the all year round, I guess it's something that you would be easier to manage.
Yeah. Now the other thing is, I don't know what sort of range you get in the quality and weight of your dairy calves, but we have to deal, when you've got a young breeder flock, then you get very light day-old chicks that can be 25, 27 grams. You've got to look after them far better than you have from 45 gram chicks. Now, if you've got 25 kilo calves, what you're going to have to do with them for the first week compared to 40 kilo calves is going to probably, I suspect, be quite different as far as the quality of management. So maybe you need a facility that's adequate for the proportion of calves that are below a certain target weight and health criteria.
Yeah, and again, that's back to looking at your own data, isn't it, and knowing your own system, and maybe some of those bits, when you find that out, you can then make the improvements to change those things before you even start. Yeah.
I also bet that your lightest, poorest calves are often from your best producing cows.
Fantastic. Thank you both. It's that's come to the end of that session. So thank you very much. Thank you to everybody for listening. The next session will be on mastitis at 1 o'clock, I believe. And there's another session also on antimicrobials later on. So I look forward to joining both of those. Thank you very much.